But the U.S. is on the brink of its fourth partial government shutdown in a decade if a Congress fails to strike a deal before the deadline tomorrow at midnight local time.
The two chambers are proposing conflicting funding bills, and the government is getting ready for backup plans that could result in worker furloughs, including in areas such as air transport. In Congress, Democrats in the Senate are discussing a stopgap bill to extend federal spending until mid-November. Meanwhile, in the Republican-controlled House, there are various bills in consideration, including a $120 billion reduction from the previously agreed-upon discretionary spending level, as well as stricter immigration laws at the Mexican border.
House Speaker Kevin McCarthy has rejected putting the Senate's bill to a vote and insisted for negotiations to go down to the wire. For more insight, let's speak now with John Aughenbaugh. He's an associate professor of political science at Virginia Commonwealth University. Professor, so Congress has less than 2 days to reach a deal. Is a government shutdown inevitable at this point? Is there any clear option to avert the shutdown?
I don't think so, in large part because of some of the stances that was just presented on the screen. You have the Speaker of the House who is unwilling to consider the stopgap funding bill coming from the United States Senate. The Senate to date has not passed any of the roughly 10 to 12 appropriations bills that typically fund the United States federal government. So the likelihood that they can craft even a stopgap funding bill within a couple days does not seem likely.
We've had close calls before when it comes to government shutdowns. Is this the closest it's been? Is this, as Julie was asking you, is this inevitable?
I wish I could say it was not inevitable, but alas, I think it pretty much is inevitable simply because there is so much work to be done. So in contrast to earlier this year, when the United States federal government was on the verge of exceeding its authority to borrow money, with that particular piece of legislation, it required some negotiation, but it was in large part a single appropriations bill. To fund the United States federal government, typically Congress breaks up the federal government budget into 10 to 12 different appropriations bills. So far, none of them have been approved. So unless the House of Representatives is willing to compromise at the last moment, it doesn't appear that the United States Senate is even remotely interested in tackling any of the fiscal year appropriations bills.
So, Professor, in the event of a government shutdown, let's say, considering the public's perception and the potential repercussions, does either side of the political spectrum win in that situation?
Of recent vintage, the political party that seemingly has suffered the most with government shutdowns has been the Republican Party, simply because many in the public, though they may understand, at least intellectually, why some Republicans would like to see federal government spending cut, many in the public just don't understand why the government cannot pass a budget. Because for many Americans, that seems to be one of the most essential reasons to have a government. Pass a budget, fund the operation of the government, and then perhaps make tougher decisions into the future. So at least in the last roughly 3 or 4 federal government shutdowns in the United States, the Republican Party typically suffers the most. And it's not so much Congress versus the president. It does seem to be one political party versus another.
And Professor, ratings agencies Moody's and Fitch have warned a shutdown could damage the federal government's credit worthiness, what would be the economic impact of a shutdown, and how could it affect markets and investors?
There's two parts to my answer. One, the most obvious effect would be in regards to the United States federal government's ability to borrow money cheaply. And because the U.S. federal government has been engaged in deficit spending so significantly over roughly the last 5 to 10 years, when the credit agencies lower the ranking for the United States federal government, it does indicate to potential investors of government securities that you may not get as good of a return or secure of a return on your investment. This will have a cascading effect in regards to the U.S. Securities and Exchange activity, because some borrowers might be less likely to invest in federal government securities and may choose to go ahead and see what or how long the government shutdown occurs. That kind of caution, that kind of concern typically is not very good for any nation's investor communities or securities and exchange communities. So there are, cascading effects of a government shutdown that indicates once again that the polarization in American politics is not just bad in terms of policy, but it's also bad in terms of the U.S. economy, both short-term and long-term.
All right, Professor, we'll have to leave it there for now, but thank you very much for your insight this morning. John Aughenbaugh, Associate Professor of Political Science at Virginia Commonwealth University.